You've heard the word oligarchy recently, but I have not heard anyone honestly talking about the whole picture. Isn't that rich? Pardon the pun. As I hear some of the left outrage after the election has finally focused on this word, I am reminded of a movie line.
You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means.
And there are really only a few possibilities. They genuinely do not know the meaning of the word. They do not understand the political landscape of the last several decades. They are oversimplifying for the average American who is weary of all of this. They are actually protecting the real oligarchy. Since most of the mainstream media is now owned by those close to the oligarchy, close as in probably among them, the last point stands as an ominous and real possibility. The rage grifting on the left is operating in full swing these days. However, if your responses are not up to their current standards of keeping the rage going, you may find yourself left out of the so-called conversation. Personally, I've been blocked on quite a number of left rage social media channels because I apparently don't live up to their rage quotient. But that's probably the point, isn't it? This way, they maintain control of their own narrative by leaning into the rage. Even some of the larger channels I once hoped would provide real journalism. They're looped on talking about the Trump oligarchy and the Musk oligarchy. If they were interested in facts, then they wouldn't be using these terms. If you believe the small group of obscenely wealthy people standing next to Trump at the inauguration are the oligarchy, or if you've been told that by some trusted news source, well, you are being misinformed and in a possibly dangerous way. It could be that they simply do not want to burden the people with reality. Maybe they don't know what the word really means, or they do not understand how it applies to America as it has existed for the last several decades. Maybe they genuinely believe what they are saying, but that doesn't make it correct or complete information, and it does actually make it bad journalism. The best way to sell propaganda is to wrap the distortions and lies and fabrications with supporting information that is essentially true. In this essay, I want to talk about what has happened in the first few months after the 2024 general election, and about who really won that election. I will be talking about what the term oligarchy really means in America. In his masterclass on scientific thinking, Neil deGrasse Tyson introduces the concept of three basic kinds of truth in our lives. There is personal truth, which we accept as true regardless of evidence. There is political truth, which benefits others when it is accepted regardless of evidence. And there is objective truth, which is true regardless of what you want to believe or are told to think. I am linking a brief video in the description introducing that class. I'll be using some visual aids for this one. The white here represents the total population of U.S. citizens of voting age. The blue here represents the number of them who registered to vote in the 2024 election. As we drill down, remember, the results of this election are not important here. I do want to visualize that, but what I want to convey is how few people are truly holding power, how many people are left out of the process without even realizing it, and how starkly they are divided. The black hole you now see is the number of people who registered to vote but didn't bother to submit a ballot. The magenta circle is all of the votes that went to other in the presidential race. The orange ellipse represents all of the people who voted for the winning candidate, which leaves the remaining visible blue to be all of those who voted for the runner-up. In full 4K UHD, each pixel represents about 30 individuals. Now, in burnt orange, you see the number of people who tipped the balance in the election. Here in isolation are the voters who set us on the path we are now following. Bear in mind that they too are caught in the long disenfranchisement of the American people over several decades. Regardless of their personal reasons for their decision in the election, they are just as much victims of the system creating all of this frustration and rage. And I expect many of them are beginning to feel a bit burnt around this point, or they will over the next few months. I do not blame them alone for the hardships that will be coming. All of these people contributed by their actions and their inactions. Those who could not be bothered to even want a say in their own governance. Those who registered but chose not to make a selection. And those who did not select one of the main party candidates. There are some who would say this last group has wasted their vote, but I very much disagree. The whole point of one person, one vote in a representative democracy is to allow people to freely voice their opinion in their own representation, regardless of their personal reasoning, and even that of those who may not have voted in order to say none of the above. They all have every right to do as they chose, and anyone criticizing them for that decision should examine their own motives in such disagreement. The orange ellipse represents less than 1/3 of the population eligible to vote. They represent less than 1/2 the total number of people who cast their votes. Both sides in this election leaned into some of the most divisive and often downright misleading campaign rhetoric in the history of this country. Certainly, you can point to examples on both sides of the balance of this race, but on the whole, there was one side that effectively depended on their misrepresentations and fabrications, and they did win the race for that. Many people in this country are frustrated and angry. They're disillusioned, disenfranchised, and they have been squeezed until they have little more than hope to lean on. The vast majority of those people are represented in this group that voted for this outcome that we're all dealing with now. Studies have found that a significant portion of the population would be supportive of the violent overthrow of a tyrannical government. Studies following January 6, 2021 suggest that a still alarming number of people are willing to perform genuine violence to further their political beliefs. Some of these include those that some have started calling America's ammosexuals. What is it that has really caused this level of division and hostility to replace what was once at least a mostly civil discourse? Most of those who voted for the path we are on now, represented in orange, have been told to blame those represented here in blue for all their woes, and they are many. Let me leave you no doubt of the legitimacy of many of their issues. Since the results of the election, however, we have seen a rise in hostility and resentment of those mostly represented here in the blue as well, of those who voted for the winning candidate. That hostility is being a huge win to those who really won the 2024 election. and who are largely behind the ever-rising division and resentment between the left and the right. I am leaving the orange ellipse to represent those most affected over the last several decades by government policies and actions which impacted them more than most people in America. The green circle represents the most wealthy 0.1% of the population of America. The darker dot in the center is those few who wield personal wealth in excess of around $1 billion. Oh, wait, you don't see that, do you? Here they are. Had to zoom in quite a bit to even see them. Less than around 1,000 individuals in this country wield that kind of personal wealth. The oligarchy is not the whole of them, but the oligarchy is effectively entirely within this group. The rest of the wealthiest 0.1% certainly play their roles. The reason that such hostility between the left and the right is vital to these people is this group of people they have created who are so enraged to carry out actual violence. You see, this group is significantly larger than them and would roll over them like Judgment Day if they ever figured out who they should really be enraged at. The people in this green circle know that they are better than you. And they have been doing a pretty good job at being invisible until the last couple of decades, anyway. I'll come back to that point in a little bit. They have been in effective control of all of this for much of the last several decades. The Reagan presidency was an inflection point for their consolidation of power and influence. In 2012, Martin Gilens published a book with the title Affluence and Influence, which was the result of a study to determine the real distribution of power in American politics. In an ideal or representative democracy, you would expect the influence of the population to look something like this. Here, the probability of a policy that is not popular is low of being created, and the more popular the policy is, the more likely it will become law. Throughout human history, though, we know that the wealthy have a bit more influence with the leadership, no matter the form of government. But what he actually found was something genuinely surprising. He found that for low-income people, the influence they have on policies is nearly none at all. For middle-income people, the influence is actually even slightly negative. Wealth alone is the single factor significant in what the government does. What he discovered was real and palpable evidence of a strongly established oligarchy in America in the years of his study ending in 2012. The Reagan years were not really the start of this influence, yet this was when the real transfer of wealth from we the people to the wealthiest class began to open up. The policies implemented created the foundation for the concentration of power to large corporations and the wealthiest individuals. White on this chart represents the lowest 90% of the U.S. wealth distribution. The larger green circle represents the wealthiest 1% of the U.S. population. Over the last 50 years or so, around $50 trillion has been transferred from the lower 90% to the upper 1% of the population. This is the true achievement of tinkle-down economics. This is what you were told tinkle-down economics would bring us. This is what those who drove this form of capitalism knew would happen. This is more than mere influence. This is the largest upward redistribution of wealth in history. Full stop. But this was not merely about wealth. It was about total control. It was a profound reshaping of the power dynamic in America, leaving we the people with only the illusion of influence at the ballot box. Divide that $50 trillion into the population represented here in white. Each and every one of we the people in the lower 90% has, on the average, contributed around 200,000 of their own labor and worth to the wealthiest 1% in America. Do you think that maybe they have taken too much for too long? Three people in this image control more wealth than 50% of the rest of we the people. That is certainly not what our founders had in mind. Most of them at least imagined enough to fill a slightly larger venue, say a large convention hall. Those represented in the white here produce with our labor and other efforts the entirety of the wealth that America generates. We are the most wealthy nation in all of human history. And I would bet a whole dollar that most of these people did not have their 200,000 contribution in hand at any point along the way. I would bet another whole dollar that all outside that green circle would probably like some large portion of the very real wealth they created back, one way or another. You may complain about government redistribution of wealth, yet this is exactly what has happened for over the last 5 decades now, just not in your favor. Ironically, you've probably only really opposed it when it would have likely benefited you, thanks to the rhetoric from those controlling the levers of power. If enough of them figured this out, I would also bet another dollar that they would roll over this little green circle like an Old Testament story of smiting. If push came to shove, and they had to come to some sort of an equitable arrangement, I wonder which group they would be more willing to negotiate with. Actually, no, I don't wonder that at all. What the American oligarchy is has enough complexity and nuance to be an entirely separate essay, and it will be that. In short, though, it is mostly the natural byproduct of the form of capitalism that we practice here in America. In the years leading up to the Reagan era, money started to leak more and more overtly into the political landscape, and the Reagan era began the more thorough dismantling of the limitations and regulations that were imposed the last time the robber barons got control over the system. I'm not one to indulge in giant Bond villain conspiracy theories. That said, what was done requires multiple people creating a plan to influence control over some of the levers of power, and then taking tangible action to implement that plan. That absolutely meets the legal definition of a conspiracy. So I must concede, there was a conspiracy. I'll explore this more in another essay, but this wasn't the kind of tightly coordinated end-game-driven plot that we often imagine. Instead, it was the laying of a foundation, one that created a mechanism by which the wealthiest could shape government policy to serve their own interests. What emerged from this historic inflection point is what I will be calling the soft power oligarchy. It is, in many ways, the natural evolution of American capitalism. There is no need for a rigid lockstep conspiracy when the system itself enables those with enough wealth to steer the choices available to the voters. It's a Boss Tweed-style game The wealthy don't have to control the votes if they get to control who gets nominated in the first place. For now, suffice it to say that by the time the research for the book I mentioned above was conducted, 2012, the presence of a well-established oligarchy was undeniable. From where I live, both physically and intellectually, I have not seen much of the strife that the last several decades have wrought on less fortunate Americans. As an accident of the investigations I took on a hobby during the recent public health crisis that picked up around 2020, I became aware of and met more people who have been much more affected than those where I live. I have seen less wage growth than expected back in the day, but we're hanging on, and that is far better than many who have been strongly hit by the effects of the upsuck economics that started in the Reagan era. This let me look more closely over the last year or so at how things really evolved over the last several decades. I totally understand the disillusionment feeding the outrage of so many. When so many of the rest of us are not feeling these changes so acutely. There are other factors. It's a very complex system. On the whole, those feeling the squeeze most profoundly have been told that it is the liberal elite responsible for their woes. Since many of we the people do not seem so strongly affected by these policies, that misinformed reasoning sticks. Also, because it is not effectively countered by those who seem to be just taking the blame. As the problems have grown to being serious impacts on the lives of so many people, the divisive rhetoric has had to be elevated towards both sides. The sole purpose of this is to distract the vast majority of people from ever discovering the real root cause of this. The goal is to divide the voting population as perfectly as possible, so that no political party ends up with enough influence to really change anything effectively. The overt danger for all of us is the growing number of people so desperate and enraged that they may resort to violence for anyone to hear their pleas. This is why we see more acts of stochastic terrorism and why so many are carried out by people who seem to be supportive of the party currently in control of the government. Who is in control has been largely irrelevant to their prosperity for decades now, but they are most affected by those policies. You see, if you are above around the 50% or so of that wealth distribution, you're probably getting by. You are not buying new cars as often, maybe looking for sales on bigger purchases, but you have not felt the existential threat those below that level have been feeling. That fact alone makes the rhetoric about the liberal elites seem more plausible. If you simply remove the word liberal, by the way, the statement is entirely correct. Once again, the best way to sell a lie, well, a political truth, is to wrap it with essentially true information. Many of those below the 40 to 50% of the wealth distribution are having to make choices about groceries or prescriptions, car payment or rent payment, or even facing losing their car or housing. In one of the strongest economic recoveries, objectively speaking, in the history of the world, they are still living in existential crisis, mostly as a result of upsuck economics. How much better would things be, even for a short term, if people got some portion of that gladly contributed $200,000 back from the oligarchy, even just $50,000, even just $10,000 would be life-changing for so many of them in ways those of us not so profoundly affected understand. Bill Gates, certainly well into that wealthy 0.1%, has suggested that in a fair tax system, his wealth would have been taxed at around 67%. And I, for one, think those levels might be a good place to think about starting. We, the people, are the engine that generates all of this extraordinary wealth. More than any other economy on the planet, we, the people, have a reasonable expectation to benefit as a society from the extraordinary wealth that we generate. We must also realize that there is a vital skill in the people represented in this little green circle, and that shouldn't be completely dismissed. They do have profound abilities to organize efforts and turn ideas into profitable ventures. It is not only fair, but it is important that they be rewarded for these extraordinary skills. Those who invest in and back such ventures are due a return on their investment. But those who actually make the thing happen must directly see much more of the benefits of their work than the current system provides. The benefits supporting such a venture is also a choice of we the people through our participation in a representative democracy, and the entire society is due some benefits from all of this success. In the massive foofra of the idea of bringing in Canada as another state, some interesting questions have been asked by people trying to determine the relative benefits of that. It has been observed that given the population and that amount of land, on the whole, Canada is just above the wealth level of our poorest states. Two questions arise from that analysis and observation. One is why we would be interested in bringing in such a poor and underperforming land. The other is how such a poorly performing society can afford universal health care for all of its citizens. The answer to the second one is simple. We, the people, are simply not a priority for that little green circle. In a nation ostensibly governed of, by, and for we the people, we have failed in managing our own governance. We now move in a terribly precarious place where we stand against a clear and present danger of losing what our ancestors fought and died to hand us. The rage that has been so effectively cultivated between the left and the right is not merely a product of political discourse. It is the result of a system designed to divide us, ensuring that those who have already taken control of the levers of power remain unnoticed and uninterfered with.